Right now, let's go straight to my first guest this hour, former head of the British Army, Lord Dannatt, who joins us to talk about the Strategic Defence Review. A very good afternoon to you, sir.
Hello, Julia. Good afternoon to you and your viewers.
Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Well, you've heard a lot of the detail. To be honest, a lot of it was dribbled out in the media before we actually had the Prime Minister standing up today in Glasgow announcing some more of the details, more this afternoon. There'll no doubt there'll be quite a lot in the small print. But in terms of what the government has laid out, I just went through some of it. Is it enough to be able to defend our country?
Well, there are 62 recommendations in this Strategic Defence Review. And I think the premise of the policy aspects of it are pretty good. But success or failure is going to be completely determined by whether it can be funded. Yes, we know this government is committed to raising to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. But now we're only hearing that we're going to go to 3%, possibly not any earlier than 2034. Julia, that's a little bit like in 1937 saying to Adolf Hitler, please don't attack us until 1946 because we won't be ready.
That is quite an analogy. Do you believe that the threat to us, to our NATO allies, that we are legally bound to protect, is so great as the threat that was posed in the 1930s to Europe?
Well, the big difference between now and then is that we are a member state of NATO and we're all bound by Article 5, which, as we all know, is an attack on one member, is an attack on all. So let's just put this in the context of where we are today. We have an aggressive neighbour, Vladimir Putin's Russia, and he's fighting that very bloody war, and the Ukrainians are doing fantastically. But let's just think that if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, say in a few months' time, by most people's calculation, the Russians, about 2 years after that, will have replenished and refurbished their armed forces. But if they wanted to test the strength of Article 5, they'd be in a position to make a probing attack, say, on one of the Baltic states. And that would really test whether United Kingdom, United States, other European countries are willing to stand together against further aggression from Russia. So we have to take this threat seriously. We have to take the recommendations of this defence review seriously. And the government, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have got to think really hard about funding it and funding it properly and doing so soon.
And especially the context, we've got the Defence Secretary of the US, Pete Hegseth, echoing actually what a lot of people's concerns are in terms of China's ambitions in Taiwan. And again, like Vladimir Putin, they've said the quiet bit out loud. They intend to take Taiwan back in whatever way necessary. But talking about a threat to Taiwan being imminent. Now, a lot of people might think, well, what's that got to do with us, the other side of the world? Of course, that trade routes, the economy, world economic collapse as a result of that. But also, crucially, America focused in that on that side of the world, won't be focused on Europe and puts more on us and our European allies to defend ourselves.
Well, Julia, that's exactly the point. And I think Pete Hegseth was very clear at the summit in the Far East quite recently that the Indo-Pacific area and the rising threat from China is the United States' primary focus. Now, the big thing for us here in Europe is two things. One is to make sure that we step up our spending and our defence capability so that we can properly look after ourselves in Europe. And secondly, we've got to make sure that we keep the United States bound into NATO, bound in to that Article 5 commitment in some shape or form. If the Americans are going to do less, and they will do less in Europe, then we Europeans have got to do more. That's the top line and the bottom line. And this defence review spells it out very clearly. But it comes down to funding at the end of the day.
Yeah.
2.5% is not enough. 3% by 2034 is not enough. We've got to have 3% by the end of this Parliament, 2029, and probably a debate about going to 3.5% by 2034. Those are the figures that the NATO summit is going to demand in a week or two's time.
I mean, exactly. We've got a lot of big defence events coming up in the next few weeks and months. Certainly states that have a border with Russia are now looking at 5% of spending. So polls, the Baltic states are spending more. They're very much gearing up to that. Can I ask you, though, in terms of Vladimir Putin wanting to sort of make a foray into the Baltic states, because he shares a border with the Baltic states, but why would he? A lot of people be saying, but why would he? Why we got this threat in Ukraine, but why would he want to try and take the Baltic states when he would know that they are protected by that NATO umbrella?
Well, of course, that's a really good question, and it's one of the major geostrategic unknowns. What would Vladimir Putin do? But what we do know from all that he's said and written and done so far is that he has this undiminished ambition to restore Greater Russia. As we all know, he wants to absorb Ukraine back into Russia. Yeah. And he looks at countries like the Baltic states, like Finland and other states that were part of the Soviet Union in the past, and he would love to reabsorb some of those. But most particularly, I think, by probing at NATO, he'll be probing the strength of Article 5, because I think he would love nothing else more than to see the cohesion of the West and the cohesion of NATO that defeated the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1989-90, to see that melt away. And then he would feel that he really can exert the influence that he wants to grow Russia's significance and Russia's power.
I remember so much the reporting around and comments by politicians about the efforts they made against Vladimir Putin after he invaded Ukraine, and the economic sanctions and the unity that was shown eventually on that issue. And then more patting themselves on the back saying, Donald Trump, not Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin didn't expect us to unite and defend Ukraine. And I always thought that was not a success, that was a failure. If Vladimir Putin had really believed that the West would ally themselves strongly to Ukraine, he probably wouldn't have invaded in the first place. How do we convince Vladimir Putin, or indeed Xi Jinping of China, that the West is united and not just able to fight and defend our allies, but willing as well? Because there are some big question marks about the willingness of some leaders, but also the willingness of even our own fellow countrymen and women to defend our own country, let alone an ally.
Well, you've raised some big issues there, but on that last point, our government has got to be absolutely clear that there are threats to our security, and they have got to make sufficient funds and capability available to deter further aggression. And here's the critical bit: they've got to speak with one united voice to the people of this country and say, we've got to get serious about our own security, not just the threat from Russia, which is manifest and in many ways is ongoing even now, particularly with cyber attacks and other such deniable events, but also just trying to protect our own borders from the huge number of migrants that are coming across the channel. I mean, there are many threats to our security, and our government's got to speak with one strong voice to persuade the people of this country that the government is serious, they're taking a lead, they're going to provide properly for our security so that we can get on and live our lives peacefully, and actually then do things like grow the economy and all the other things the government wants to do, and spend more on other priorities. But first and foremost, we've got to get our security. We've got to be strong at home and strong abroad, as the government keeps saying, but they've got to mean it and they've got to say it. And
you mentioned the economy a number of times. This is about the Treasury purse strings. Every defence secretary has left office and gone, I wanted to spend a lot more, I want to do. Every ex-chief of staff has done an interview saying they wanted to spend more, they couldn't get that funding. Is the problem in the Treasury, you can't get the money? And is that bean counters or politicians who simply don't accept the reality of the threat?
I think it's the issue of priorities. The Prime Minister, I think, is increasingly clear that the defence of this country and our security is a high priority. But within the Treasury, there are so many other pressures, whether it's to do with the National Health Service, whether it's to do with care, whether it's to do with schools, other aspects of national infrastructure, that they just can't bring themselves to say, yes, OK, these things are important, but what is the most important is to spend more on our defence. Yeah. That's what's got to go home. That penny has got to drop. Or not that penny, those billions of pounds have got to drop in the Treasury to understand that this is the rock of our society.
Well, we've got a load of nuclear-powered subs. We'll be no doubt building jets and goodness knows what. What about the actual number of fighting men and women who are there on the ground? Because the number of people who've made ex-forces, people who've been our guests are pointing out, it's all very well you can take territory, but you can't hold territory without men on the ground. And goodness me, we've seen that very, very, very clearly in Ukraine. I would say also in Gaza as well in recent years. We've got a fighting force that's supposed to be 73,000, but it's actually only 70,000. Got a problem with retention, recruitment, boosting pay and the living conditions, obviously a factor, although that doesn't in itself mean that we're more able to defend ourselves. How many men and women fighting forces should we actually have if we want to, be able to seriously know that we can protect ourselves?
Well, numbers are important, but at this moment in time, I think what is more important is that we've got the right equipment, the right leadership and the right training. And the equipment bit is the expensive bit. Once we're properly equipping the 75,000 or so, which is the figure that the current government, roughly that figure, wants to get the army back to. Once we've got that size force properly equipped and organised and trained and well led, and we've got great leadership within our armed forces, then we can think about expanding it. I think what we will see in the detail of this defence review are some measures about increasing our reserves, our Army Reserve, Navy Reserve, Air Force Reserve, but particularly our Army Reserve, and maybe also this idea of some kind of third force or home service force to protect key installations and parts of our national infrastructure. I think that's all good, but the most important thing is to sort out the equipment to make sure that the soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines we've got are properly equipped to do the job we're currently asking of them.
Yeah, goodness, I remember covering as political editor in the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, and so much the conversation was about the lack of even decent flak jackets for our serving men and women.
Well, don't tell me about that, Julia. I was the Army Chief during both those campaigns, and my head got very sore banging it against the brick wall of number 10 and number 11.
This is basic stuff. We do seem to struggle in this country, or is this what happens everywhere with procurement, with getting the right stuff at the right price, at the price we'd originally negotiated, to the right quality and getting it quickly? An awful lot of money is going to be spent on, nuclear powered submarines, this and that. But are we actually going to pay, a reasonable price and get it when we need it? Because we seem to have a uniquely poor record on this in this country.
No, you make a good point there. I mean, yes, we've got to spend more, but we've got to spend better. The history of our defence procurement has been pretty woeful in the past. So we've got to have better project management. We've got to make sure that when we've stated a requirement, we've let it out to industry, that the conduct of delivering on that contract is well policed and is well done to time and to cost. And that requires some discipline from the user, not to change the requirement halfway through a contract. Because when we do that, that brings in more costs and it brings in delay. So discipline is required on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Just finally, before I let you go, Lord Dannatt, look, we're going to have the Defence Secretary making a statement later. We've had the Prime Minister giving a speech today, and we've seen, incredible agreement from, Greens and Lib Dems, Labour, Tories, Reform Party. We need to spend more money on defence. We need to make our country safe and be able to protect our allies. What would you say if you had the Prime Minister? Foolishly, he doesn't listen to my show, I'm pretty sure, but if he was listening to my show, he'd probably know a lot more. What message would you send to the Prime Minister right now as a man who has been in the position of, being the head of the British Army? What would you tell him?
What I'd say to him is, Prime Minister, look back to Tony Blair, your predecessor, his defence review of 97-98. It was great policy work, just like your defence review would look as if it's going to be. But it failed because the Chancellor of the day, Gordon Brown, refused to fully fund it. And if you let Rachel Reeves refuse to fully fund this defence review, then frankly, you're going to go down in the bad boys column of history and not do and argue for what we absolutely need in the best interests of this country. Look back at history, learn the lesson and get it right this time, Prime Minister.
Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army, so appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Thank you very much indeed.